Chris Mackowski for Emerging Civil War. July 17th, 1864 marked one of the most important turning points of the entire Civil War. On that day, Confederate President Jefferson Davis replaced General Joseph Eggleston Johnston with John Bell Hood in command of the Army of Tennessee. It's been a decision that's been second-guessed for a century and a half. Our own Steve Davis has a fantastic essay that deconstructs the decision-making process that went into that decision in our Turning Points of the American Civil War book, available as part of our Engaging the Civil War series through Southern Illinois University Press. Got to get the book plug in there. Great book. Love it a lot and love Steve's essay. And he really talks about what went into that. A lot of hand-wringing on Davis's part. He was no fan of Johnston, particularly since Johnston was underperforming during the, or in his eyes, underperforming during the Atlanta campaign in the same ways that Johnston had underperformed in the Peninsula campaign. But he really didn't have a whole lot of alternatives. And as he cast about looking for someone who could possibly replace him, tapping into all sorts of advisors and advice, he really was kind of drawing a blank. Hood's on his radar screen because after Hook's injury at the Battle of Chickamauga, he's recovering back in Richmond and falls in with Davis's company, and Davis and Hood become friends. And so that's sort of what's going to take someone who is a very competent, hard-fighting division commander and make him someone who becomes suddenly a candidate, not just for Corps command, but instead command of an entire army. Robert E. Lee, who was quite familiar with Hood's performance, was not sold on this. When Davis asked for Lee's opinion, Lee said that Hood is a bold fighter, but may lack the other necessary qualities. And he talked about how Hood, has not had large responsibility before. Lee actually recommended Hardee for the position. He said that Hardee had more experience commanding an army than Hood did, but Hardee did not want to serve. I think, again, trying to look at Old Reliable's old reputation, he didn't want to put that at risk by assuming command of an army that was having some problems. And indeed, the Army of Tennessee was having problems. William T. Sherman had an army group of 110,000 men. The Army of Tennessee had about 53,800 or so. And so they were really kind of backed up against the city, backed up against the mountains, backed up against the wall. Use what sort of cliche you want there. Johnston, at the start of that campaign, all the way up in the northwestern corner of Georgia, conducting a Fabian tactic, a Fabian strategy of withdrawing, trying to delay, trying to avoid a major confrontation that would pit his numerically inferior number against Sherman's larger force. Again, trying to find an opportunity to strike when he could, but otherwise delaying and delaying and delaying. After the wars, in his memoirs, Ulysses S. Grant said that Johnston had absolutely the right idea, trying to husband his men and his land and resources as possible without bringing on an general engagement in which everything might be lost. After the war, Johnston saw this as vindication of his strategy. But the political climate in Richmond was not such that this sort of delaying tactic would really work. Johnston didn't have to win, he just had to not lose. But that was not the right mindset for Richmond, which really wanted to take the offense, be bold, strike a blow, and really try to cripple the Federals. Johnston knew that wasn't going to happen. So by mid-June, morale within his officer corps is pretty low because this delaying tactic, Johnston saying he's doing everything he can, Davis at wit's end, trying to cast about for that replacement. When Hood comes in, he's going to launch an attack on July 20th. He's going to launch another one on July 22nd. He's going to launch another one on July 28th. Over the course of that first week in holding the office of the command of the Army of Tennessee, he's going to lose some 11,000 men. That's as many as Johnston had lost in the entire month and a half preceding that. Johnston's going to do a lot after the war to try to downplay his casualties even more. So it's, it gets a little dicey as we look at comparisons with casualty figures, but there's no mistake. Hood's offensive mindedness, throwing these aggressive attacks, is going to do a lot to damage that army in its early days. Hood's going to have a pretty successful time harassing Sherman's rear after Atlanta falls in September, but it's really going to be a problematic thing for the army to have this aggressive commander who's going to try and and not be able to succeed in going on the offense. Then, of course, Hood has his desperate gamble. Lee White, my colleague with ECW, a historian down at Chickamauga, Chattanooga, he says that Hood doesn't really have any other choices. He takes this desperate gamble and strikes up into Tennessee, trying to do what he can to disrupt Union operations there. We all know that ends in grief in Franklin, and then a few days later in Nashville, and essentially the Army of Tennessee is gone. So I've always looked at this as a turning point, because when Hood takes command and his offensive mindedness kicks in, he's basically going to bleed the Army of Tennessee dry. So the Confederacy won't have a viable army in the West with which to operate once Hood takes command, because Hood is going to use that army up. It is a very Robert E. Lee-like strategy. You know, Lee also is going to take the offense when he takes command of the Army of Northern Virginia, or what he christens the Army of Northern Virginia, trying to strike that knockout blow. You know, Hood's playing by that same playbook. But by that point of the war, 1864, Hood just doesn't have the resources to be able to be effective at it. So it's going to really make the Confederacy's ability to wage war in the West almost non-existent. And that's what makes his ascent to command so controversial and such an important turning point. Something to think about, lots to unpack there. I hope you take the opportunity. We've got a lot of blog posts you can read about it. Steve Davis's essay in the Turning Points book, and some good insights on the blog from Dave Powell as well. I'm Chris Mackowski. Thanks for joining us here at Emerging Civil War.